Welcome to Travel Around the Block. Join Joel, Mike, and their guests as they explore how Web3 and AI are reshaping the way we journey, invest, and connect across the globe.
Welcome and welcome back to Travel Around the Block, where we dive deep with trailblazers shaping the future of travel and technology. We're your hosts, Joel and Mike, and today we have an extraordinary guest, Philip Charm. Phil is the co-founder of Clarasight, the AI-powered operating system for corporate travel, enabling corporations to reduce costs, save time, and protect revenue. Clarasight is trusted by the world's leading enterprises with more than $4 billion in managed spend. That was $4 billion with a B on the Clarasight platform. So great to have you here, Phil. We're honored you're spending a bit of time with us. So thanks again for joining us in our little coffee shop. Good to see you.
It's good to see you too. I think actually I can tell you, I think we just passed 5 billion in spend. So I'm going to correct you just slightly there. I
We,
take great pride in each one of those because like everything else, and I'm sure we got into it, like it takes forever to become an overnight success. And so I think the first 5 years it took to get to 1 million, and then it took a lot less time to get to 5 billion.
I've always heard, Phil, the first 4 billion are the toughest. So congrats on that astonishing milestone. You know, a lot of us are counting like number of likes on Facebook, and you're over here going, we've added an incremental billion in managed spend on the platform. So huge kudos. Phil, for those in the audience who may not know you quite as well as Mike and I do, it'd be really cool if we could maybe peel the onion just a little bit, rewind the clock, and just hear a little bit about your journey and background, because the audience just heard the eye-popping figure at 5B, and they might be wondering, how does one do that? How does that happen in life? And so maybe you could rewind the clock a little bit and tell us how such things come to be in this world.
I think like anything else, history, when you look back at it, is very linear, but certainly my journey is one that didn't feel linear in the moment. It felt like a bunch of moving pieces as I'm constantly searching for my purpose. I think that's really been a summary of my professional journey, which is searching for what I feel like I'm meant to do. And that's a combination of what I'm good at, what brings me joy, and what has impact on the world. And for me, that essentially was the startup world. I've been in more or less the technology startup space my entire professional career. Before that, I was an aspiring athlete. I was just a good enough tennis player to realize that I wasn't a very good tennis player, is the way I like to describe it.
I bet you had to be very good to have that insight. In other words, at the highest echelons of tennis, you realize, oh, there's a whole nother door after that.
I think that learning was what kind of drove me, which is the way I like to describe it. So I was good, and I was a top 20 in the United States growing up. I was top 10 in college, and then went to the pros and realized that I wasn't very good. It's like getting on Everest and making it through the clouds and realizing that you still have 2/3 of the mountain to go. And that's what happened for me. And so I was like, this isn't going to happen. Like, we got to go find something else. An ex-athlete who was an alum of my school, took pity on me and essentially brought me into his startup in 2006. And I got to experience going from 75 to many hundreds, and then see the floor drop during the 2008 crisis. And so it's a fabulous learning journey. And I actually think building companies is very similar to that same experience I had with tennis, which is like lots of people do things, and then you experience something remarkable and you realize how much better other people are than you. And that's what I love. I love waking up every day feeling like I'm behind, like the world is moving, that I'm being challenged, and it brings me that competitive juice. And so if you look across what I've done, I've been lucky enough to identify really fabulous people working on spectacularly hard problems, and then being like, I want to learn from you. And so I'm going to come in and do whatever I can to help build this company. And I've been lucky enough over the last 15 years or so to help 3 or 4 different companies go from relatively small to quite large. And that then led me to founding Clarasight, which is my first time running my own company with my college roommate and best friend of 25 years.
I'm a big fan of origin stories. And so you just mentioned Adam, your co-founder. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about the origins of this particular venture that you're on and how that sort of came about. And maybe, I always think it's interesting to look at what the original thought was and how maybe that's tweaked or morphed or evolved over time.
So the journey for Adam and I started, I guess we're going on 5 years ago. So both of us had gone through a very intense period of building companies, not together, but separately. And he had just sold his last company. He'd been in the education space. He sold it to WeWork at the height of the experience of WeWork, right before they were going to go public. And then
Yeah.
all those things played out. And at WeWork, he was actually put in charge of sustainability. And yeah, at
Cool.
that point, tens of thousands of employees trying to think about how to apply sustainable practices across a global enterprise was really hard. And that took him down a rabbit hole of trying to figure out how to solve that problem. And I'll skip a few steps, but I had just finished helping scale another company and was trying to figure out what was going to be next. And we connected over just a common set of themes, which is we recognized how hard it is to build a company. And so we were at a moment where we were really lucky, very privileged to be able to pick what we wanted to do next. And so we built or made a decision based on two very simple principles, which is we wanted to work with people we loved, not just liked, and we wanted to work on problems that impacted our children's future. Full stop. And so that brought us into sustainability. And we ultimately started a sustainability company focused on scope 3 emissions. And we got a bunch of good customers and we grew it. And but what we learned, it was a nice to have product, not a must have product. And so as we were observing the likelihood of macroeconomic changes and regulatory changes and other things, we worked with our customers, frankly, to say, what can we do that is absolutely essential to your business? And we had a series of customers that were trying to solve travel problems. And so we really started working with them side by side around travel sustainability. And that's the evolution and where Joel, you first were introduced to us a few years ago at this point. And we were very lucky. We worked with some great companies. And then what we found, again, as you think about how do I have a lasting impact and solve a problem, is that the problem around sustainability in travel was a couple of fold. It was one, the problem statement was actually different. It was how do I reduce emissions without impacting my business performance negatively, which is actually a different problem statement than how do I reduce emissions in travel. And as you think about going from talking about it with intention to actually implementing with action, the CFO buy-in is critical. And that means you need to drive ROI and business performance. And so our customers basically told us, hey, this is great. And now we need you to cover the full suite because we have to be able to talk about cost and productivity of our people and duty of care and supplier negotiations and all of that in order for us to actually affect change. And that brought us to needing to be a sustainability company that actually supported the broader suite of travel management. And through that process, and as AI went from a thing we talked about to something that was being used to being something that actually could be driving value, it unlocked some new ways to think about supporting travel within corporations and the travel buyer, which allowed us to open up the framing and really solve a more holistic problem. And what's powerful about that is if we can really solve and reimagine how corporations manage travel, you can actually do it in a very sustainable way because every CFO is looking to reduce low value, increase the ROI, and ultimately is trying to manage and control spend. We work with a bunch of CFOs who say something to the effect of the best trip is the one not taken. Believe we
Yeah.
can have lasting impact on the world through the lens of really helping to reimagine the way corporate travel is run in the largest enterprises.
It's funny if we just rewind even 10, 15 years ago, I think there was almost this reflexive traveling habit where you could almost describe a certain amount of travel as occasionally what I might call muda. And I feel like this whole idea of being more thoughtful about, do I really need to travel? What's the ROI? What's the impact? How does that affect health, well-being, etc.? It's amazing how many subjects live at the fulcrum of, should I take that trip or not, whether it's family dynamics or corporate returns. And so I think you guys started with a thread of sustainability, but I think it's really interesting that you quickly over time realized, and now in my view, you guys are like transforming the entire tapestry or fabric of the industry, which is evidenced by the 5B on your platform. So kudos to you for like that's about as cool a learning journey as I've seen. So that's fantastic. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mike because I'm sure he has questions for you as well.
Yeah, I think that's really super awesome with the tennis background too, because a little personal story I'll share is my younger sister in high school, probably a tennis phenom for her height. And I think a lot more powerful comparing like when I was at that age. But a tennis coach came over when one of her practices and leaned over and said, "How old is she?" Because I've never seen a girl that was able to, at her age, consistently serve over 100 miles an hour, which was saying something. Later on, found out that she was actually the women's tennis coach for the U.S. Army at West Point. Long story short, she ended up getting recruited to West Point, and that's how she
Nice.
ended up at West Point as part of the tennis team. But so from that, transitioning to you real quick, Philip, my understanding is that you didn't really come from travel, fell into travel a bit. Would that be a somewhat of a fair statement?
I think it absolutely is, right?
Yeah,
For my entire, but did not come from the travel world.
the travel industry.
And so I think that is both a blessing and a curse as we've experienced.
Right.
But yes, definitely did not come from the travel industry. I'm a few years in, and I think I'm just building enough credibility so I can say I don't know most things, but I know just enough to know I don't know a lot. This is the way I would describe it.
And I think that's fantastic in a way because you're able to look at travel from a different lens, right? Not coming in with maybe some traditional biases on how travel industry works and the complexities around it. So I'm really curious because you had that fresh eye perspective of looking at travel. Was there anything that you saw, recognized through that journey where immediately that kind of just took you away, either if it's a positive or a negative thing?
I'd say the thing that I noticed almost immediately is how insular the travel industry is. And I think that's really important for a whole bunch of reasons, which is one, as you think about being a new supplier or partner in this space, the amount of time it takes to build a minimum level of credibility with the stakeholder matters a lot. And this is a networked based industry. And so the trust factor or lack of trust, as it might be, is absolutely critical. And that's agnostic to product. And I think that's a really important distinction. The second piece of that is it is insular, but it is heavily driven on professional development, mentoring, and coaching. And so I found just a wealth of knowledge of people who were predisposed to want to teach me, which was an incredible way to learn about the industry and to learn about the problems. And then what you get to do when you get to listen, you get to learn, and you get to be treated like a peer, even though you don't deserve it, is you can bring the perspectives from outside. And I'm basically a believer that there's really no snowflakes. There are common patterns and common approaches. And so if you look at how we initially engaged in the space, we basically said, hey, what you're trying to do is basic financial planning and management, but you do it in a different way than the rest of the business does. And so a lot of the core principles that we've brought to bear are, how does a CFO think about managing a business? How do they think about making decisions? How does an IT and data team think about structuring and managing data? And then how does a business, whether you're talking about a buyer or a procurement leader or a traveler or a business leader, like how do they need to make decisions? And pulling the best practices that come from other parts of an organization and thinking about how they can apply to the travel space. And I'd say 70% of it, the principles really work. And then you need to think about applying it. And there's a group of it that just doesn't work. Like 30% just fundamentally, like there are issues with travel that are specific to travel where you can't really pull. You have to think about applying traditional travel principles and approaches to bear. But that's really the mix. And I think it's been an amazing ability to just have patterns, and then also just being deeply appreciative of this community desperately wanting to teach, educate, empower, and engage.
Also, you're solidifying your foundation, and you obviously have a overarching vision for Clarasight, but you're also taking a lot of inputs. It seems like you've been adaptable and adjusting. Just curious, has that impacted the overarching vision for the company? And if so, what might have adjusted or changed? So essentially trying to get a sense of what the vision is for the company and any kind of course correction adjustment along the way.
Yeah, I think the world we live in today, like you better take a first principled approach to things and you better do it pretty frequently. The way I describe it now is I think you have to be validating product market fit every 30 days. It's just that dramatic in terms of the changes. And so I think for us, as it relates to the vision, as we really got deep into travel, what we tried to understand is what do we think the future of travel is going to look like? And so I think for us, it's about learning what that vision means, peeling back the onion, as you said, and then really understanding how big the opportunity can be for us and what role we should play in that process. I think it's a refinement exercise of what is the future going to look like? What is the role of the travel buyer? What is the role of travel? And then how do we enable that future given all the pieces? And that's generally been at a high level, relatively consistent. I think the thing that fundamentally shifts is how are you going to do that today? And the challenge I think we face, and we work very closely with our customers and the market and everything, is to balance where companies know they want to go versus what they can adopt and use today. And the gap and the disconnect is enormous. And that's true across the enterprise, particularly around AI adoption and readiness, but it's particularly acute in travel. And so I'd say the biggest challenge that I constantly am struggling with is how do I make sure I'm solving the problems that people can implement today without losing focus on where I think we're going to go and where the world is going to go in the future, knowing that there's this gap of an unknown amount of time for basically enterprise AI adoption and readiness and what I'll call travel infrastructure and ecosystem evolution. And that's a really hard problem to solve. Use a fun example like NDC. NDC is what, 15 years into the journey and it's still called new, right? Like the adoption cycles for these infrastructure and like what is the role of content? Where is content going to come from? How is the TMC going to manage it? Like, what is the GDS going to look like? These are all really interesting dynamics, which are going to be layered into the adoption cycles of the enterprise. And I have some customers that are ready to adopt today. And I have others that are saying, honestly, like it's at least 3 years, like maybe 5. And it's very hard as a startup to balance both those environments.
Phil, as I'm listening to you, I can't help but think of this analogy that maybe back in the day, a startup, as harrowing as a journey as startups have always been, maybe in the past it was a little bit more you're crossing a river and there are like 3 to 5 stones and you've got to step across these stones. But now, as you're talking, and I'm thinking about the pace of acceleration of what's possible, it's almost like the stones are actually maybe in a tiered kind of step formation, and maybe some of them don't even look like stones. And I think the amount of insight and sort of three-dimensional view required to lead any organization, whether it's an established player or a massively successful startup or a startup 2 days old, whatever the case. I just think the amount of insight necessary today is probably about as high as it's ever been. So it's really cool to see. Matt, over to you, Mike,
Yeah,
again.
I just kind of want to circle back because I took a mental note and flagged this comment that Philip said, which is devalidating, right? You go through a process of devalidating what you guys are doing, what the vision and the approach is. And I don't think early stage startup founders are doing that enough, essentially, right? When you're constantly trying to, there's so much that you're trying to work on, everything from building your product, building your leadership team, getting investments and so forth. And then you lose sight of, especially nowadays, with how fast certain things are moving and how quick you can be a solo founder and how quick you can build your initial founding team with AI, etc. But I want to ask you, Philip, when you say you're when you go through this process of devalidating every few months or so, what is your approach? How do you pick out any signal versus noise when you go through that exercise?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think what we found is that the traditional signals aren't great signals anymore. So if you think about how it used to be, you look at product usage and sessions and stuff like that. And for us, we found that in many respects, that's a red herring, right? As you're moving to automation and delivering outcomes instead of features, you want to have certain types of people doing certain things less in the products, and you want it to be done for them, or you want to avoid it. And so it's a lot about quantification of what didn't happen, right? It's a counterfactual, right? It used to take you X amount of time to deliver a report. It now takes you much less time and you're doing other things. A lot of that doesn't happen in a product. And so it's really outcomes driven. And so with that, it's like just a ruthless minute to minute focus on getting better, improving, and trying to keep your edge. And the second piece is I'm incredibly lucky. The number of members of the travel community that give me feedback on a weekly basis is unbelievable. Multiply that by our team members, and we are getting signals and feedback from the market in orders of magnitude that are really high. And we're small enough we can act on that quickly. And we believe that we don't know everything. And that's a third, like, really important part of the culture of the company and how we think about things, which is we believe that we have strong opinions loosely held. And so we want everyone to have a data-driven perspective. It doesn't matter your tenure or your experience or your role. And then we need people to recognize when their perspectives are wrong and be like, you know what, you're absolutely right. I goofed this one. And so we find that all the time amongst our team and amongst the community. And that allows us to say, you know what, we screwed up, like, badly. And we're going to make the change. And it's not a change that gets put on a roadmap that might get hit in 9 months. It's a change that you might see tomorrow. Like, I hear what you're saying. And we don't think that's the right way to do it. And by bringing the right level of transparency and culture and values to that conversation, you actually increase your trust because people really do want you to have an opinion and to push back and then listen when you're right. And so we have these constant back and forth with customers where they'll say, hey, what do you think about this? And we're like, I don't love that. Here's why. I'm gonna disagree with you, but, like, that's great. Like, I'm gonna adopt it tomorrow.
That mixture, Phil, of an appropriate amount of I don't know, just being any leader really at any scope who can hold a little bit of space for while at the same time showing immense conviction and sort of like being willing to stand their ground where appropriate and knowing when is time for which, that combination of openness and sort of fierce conviction. I just think there's something there for a lot of folks to ponder and to learn from. So I think you're highlighting some stuff that is pretty rare, at least in the wild. Like maybe HBR has written 10 articles about it, but to find it in the wild is maybe a bit rarer. I have to wonder if, if you think about the game of tennis, there's not a lot of time to overthink anything. It's probably more like acting in the sense of it's listen and respond, and tennis is a very living interaction. And I have to assume that those instincts honed over 10 billion hours on the court have served you well in your business career. Mike, I didn't mean to step on your culture
No,
question,
not at
but I
all.
think we're right at the doorstop of the culture question. So I'm going to dive into it, which is I have the sense talking to you in the past, Phil, that you see culture as a really important aspect of any organization. In my background, I've worked at places that talked a lot about hearts and minds and how everything kind of begins and ends in hearts and minds. So culture as a topic is pretty interesting to me. But in your experience, Phil, how at any of the startups in your life that you've been involved with, including obviously the current, how important is company culture to the destiny that that company ultimately reaches? What would be your take on that?
Certainly well beyond the stage that Clarasight is. I will say, I don't think I appreciated it as much until I was a founder trying to navigate the last few years, which is
Mhm.
filled with ups and downs and lefts and rights and unexpected things. And I think we have a really strong culture today with an incredible group of people, mostly through the fact that we failed and we really made mistakes early in our journey on this exact same topic. And I will hold my hand up and say I am singularly accountable for a lot of these mistakes. And so therefore we've really learned how to be better. And I won't pretend for a second that I'm a particularly good founder, but I will say I'm trying to get better every day. And this is an area that we've spent a lot of time on, um, because I think we made mistakes. I've never been prouder of the people that we have around the table and the fit and the alignment towards mission, motive, method, like that everyone brings. And I think the market, the community and travel is feeling that, and we're trying to live it every day, but it's very hard because culture and values and things like that, like, it takes a lifetime to build it and you can lose it in a day. Trust, and it's something that I'm very focused on, and certainly Adam is as well, but the last year we've done a much better job of it.
Yeah, I'm curious if you could share, like, if there's a founder listening, what would you want them to understand as they think about culture? I'm sure there are elements that are unique and kind of bespoke to that particular situation, stage, etc. But are there any at all generalizable principles about culture that you feel like you've begun to uncover in your experience?
I can only describe the mistakes that I've made and how I've tried to learn from them. So I think the thing that I struggled the most with is authenticity of culture. I had been part of things that I loved. And so I wanted to pull from those to create something of my own. But in doing that, I didn't actually translate it in a way where the people around me can say, oh, that's really Phil, versus that's Phil trying to be something. And that nuance is a really important one. And so it took a long time for me to find that authentic voice who could then really represent and communicate in a way that translated to value building, right? You are only as good as your actions and decisions show you are. And so that's actually where I found my big tension, which is I'd read a lot of books and I'd worked for great people, but it was their culture, it wasn't my culture.
Yeah.
And that's a big challenge. And so I think the thing that I would encourage other founders to struggle with is you have to be like wildly comfortable with who you are and accept the fact that you have deficiencies and issues and other things, right? I'm the youngest, bald, gray haired person. I can't change that. So I might as well just accept the fact that's me. And so I think there are two things that for me really helped me become minimally viable in the role that I'm in. One is that recognition and finding my authentic voice, and two, getting exceptionally comfortable saying I don't know. And actually now in my role, my job is to say I have no idea, but that's why you're here, because you get to figure this out and teach me. And so it's really those two things that I think have took me a really long time to start to get comfortable with, that has allowed me to become a better leader.
It reminded me of a quote, and I'm not sure if this is Steve Jobs or not, but the quote goes something like, we hire people not to tell them what to do, but for them to tell us what to do. Something like that. So I feel like there's a little bit of an ethos on that. And Philip, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this now, and maybe we're going to get into this a little bit, Joel, because I feel like Philip is on the front line of this, especially when it comes to corporate travel in the age of AI. So I'm really curious to learn from you, Phil. What is the vision for Clarasight in this future where there's this agentic commerce that's going to be happening with human travel agents as well? I'm really curious, like, how are you seeing that kind of confluence almost, right? You have human agents, you have AI agents. What's going to be the role of corporate travel managers going forward, moving into this kind of like agentic world that we're seeing coming along?
So my hypothesis is that every kind of strategic function is going to be elevated in its importance and streamlined through efficiency. And so as we think about travel, there are sort of two questions that we need to ask ourselves, which is, can we, or am I, or will we be in our company a strategic function? Because there are going to be certain industries and certain businesses where travel, not only will it be strategic, it will be even more strategic than it is today. And there will also be industries or businesses where it is less strategic. And that's a really important phrasing. The example I'll give is in professional services, travel will be even more important than it is today because trust and human to human interaction not only drives business, but it's how you develop your workforce. And in a world where AI is going to automate the lower value activities, the higher value activities are EQ and people management and stuff. And so being in front of people and doing it efficiently in an uncertain world has never been more important. So I think you're going to see this dichotomy happen.
Yeah. I think what you just said is something that the big five consulting firm would say as well, right? Is that human interaction is that EQ that's still so important to be able to be customer facing.
And it's really interesting to be on the front lines chatting with them. And I think there's a number of industries where that too. I think pharma is a great example of industries where, how, particularly in the US, how things are changing, like getting with clinicians, getting with HCPs, like really engaging to help educate and empower has never been more important, particularly when trust of information and all of those things becomes so unclear. So I think that's really part one of the question. And then the second part is, how do we elevate and empower the role of the travel buyer to be ready for this new reality? And this is something that I personally am spending a lot of time on. There's a number of people who are thinking about it who I think are just fabulously intelligent on the topic. I was with Caroline Strachan last week, who is to me like one of the gurus in this space. Like everything she says just makes. We were talking a lot about, all right, how do we bring those skill sets to bear? And Adam, my co-founder, comes from an education role. And so like we are thinking about what's the skill development we're going to bring. And so it's things like executive presence. How do you build a business case? Finance through the eyes of the CFO, executive storytelling through data, right? Technical skill sets. So that's, hey, I'm no longer going to be able to have a data analyst. I am going to probably have AI agents, but I have to understand enough to be able to evaluate whether the data makes sense. So do I have SQL skills? Do I have data skills? And then there's going to be, do I have AI skills? And so I think it's that portfolio of skill sets where you are really starting to become, you could call it like the CEO of travel in your business, or you could really call it like a true general manager. There's some nuance there, but our job is to articulate a vision, set a strategy, and then empower a team operating on our behalf to be successful and then remove obstacles, right? That's what leaders do. And I think more and more, that's what the travel buyer is going to be asked to do, which is, how do I push ownership out of decision-making so that I don't control policy at a central level, but I can start to have more dynamic, more tailored, more personalized policies to empower travelers and leaders to make the decisions that are right for them, but managing cost, managing risk, regardless of where they choose to purchase. And I think there's going to be a role for a TMC. There's going to be a role for kind of OTAs and booking solutions, and there's going to be these layers, and we're all going to be a little different, but it's going to require us to have a different set of skills. Otherwise, I just think it's going to struggle to be relevant in the future world. And that's not unique to the travel buyer. I think you could apply that same thing to finance, to operations to IT, like that will generally apply across businesses.
What are you finding in terms of the current buyer community as far as their attitude to the way their role is evolving? Is it like this is opportunity of a lifetime, or is it fear of change and resistance, or somewhere in between? And I could imagine it differs by person, but I'm just curious what patterns or trends you're seeing in terms of how that role is being viewed by the folks who are currently in that role.
I think it's a yes, right? I think everyone is concerned. I think there's a level of unease that exists amongst the travel buyer community, which is tangible. And there's a small group amongst that feels motivated and excited and empowered to lead. There is a small group that is vocal and wants to and is looking for the path. They're not perfectly empowered yet, but they're going to agitate and advocate and have the tools to do that. And then there's a pretty large group that wants to, but isn't quite sure how. And that is changing in terms of the mix of those groups. But I think that third bucket of not quite sure how is growing. And that's because one, there's a skill, there's a will gap potentially, oftentimes within their companies, right? We grow in communication and expectations are not clear. There's reorgs, there's outsourcing, there's all this stuff that's happening that makes it really hard. And then just think about what the last 60 days has been like for a travel buyer of a global program. Like, oh my, I feel every single week there's something where they're dealing with a fire where essentially they're only getting blamed. Like, it's really hard to make people super happy when the entire south of the United States has a freeze and snow. And so all disruption in the US of travel. And then you get stuff from this weekend, right, with TSA, or you get the Middle East, or you get this morning with the Air Canada flight at LaGuardia, like Heathrow Air Terminal fire, right? There has been so much stuff where the travel buyer is going to get blame and it's really hard to get credit. And that makes everyone increase their unease about the situation.
In light of the list you just went through, it's probably worth a little love note to all the travel buyers in the world who have been wrangling all that, because the world goes through, whether it's geopolitical instability or an incident, and in every case, it tends to land on the plate of the travel manager who, how can one not have empathy when you just give that a moment's thought? I'm curious, you've gathered a community of travel managers who I think you position it as a bit of an AI community in a sense. And I'm wondering, do they feel safe to share freely the good, the bad, the ugly about how their roles are evolving? Because I would think a lot of travel managers would really value a room where they felt at liberty to share whatever dumb, giant air quotes, question they might have that maybe they just feel like, where can I ask that? I would think a room where they have a lot of peer support and can kind of learn one drop at a time would maybe start to turn this whole AI evolution from something that's scary and impinging on status quo to something that's actually an opportunity and creates new possibilities. And I think for a lot of people, they probably still have that breakthrough in the future where they realize it's not just that this is going to change what was, it's also going to make a whole set of new things possible. And I'm just curious what dynamics you're seeing within that group in terms of comfort level to sort of explore that freely.
Yeah. So I'll answer it two ways. One through the lens of me, and then the other through sort of my observations from the community. I think through the lens of myself and just doing it, which is there has been an eroding of trust generally amongst longtime stakeholders. And I think people are looking for those that want to build lasting relationships that are not transactional. And so what I've found is more and more of the conversations that I'm having amongst or with the travel community is one where we are having an open discussion as friends. And they're looking for advice, they're looking for support, and frankly, they're looking for someone to listen who is and transparent about what their incentives are. And I think we have challenges around incentive models and ambiguity and transparency around those incentives, which has, I think, eroded some of the traditional trusting relationships that have existed. From a community perspective, my early observations is that people are feeling safe, but that can go away in a moment's notice. And so I think we're looking to see how things evolve. And like we have to be really focused on ensuring that it maintains the expectations of that, right? It is Chatham House rules, like who you're doing it. There is no selling in it. There are no suppliers in it. It is just a safe space for these people to work. And I think the thing that I've observed is that the best thing we can do is fail together versus speaking to. And so we're not the only ones that are supporting this journey. I'd encourage everyone to try, but we really focus on, rather than giving webinars and PowerPoint presentations, we try to create moments for us to build together, right? Let's all try something. And if I fail in the front, it creates an environment where other people feel comfortable doing that as well. And leading by doing tends to be something where you go from the difference between leadership and it's not leadership if you're walking by yourself, it's just taking a walk. And so like leading from the front and saying, it's okay, let's try this together, I think is something that is resonating with the travel community in the moment that we're in today.
I saw somebody likening learning AI to learning a musical instrument. And for that matter, maybe it's a bit like learning to play tennis when you're 5 years old with a racket in your hand for the first time. And if you think about it, we don't stand a 5-year-old on a tennis court and then talk at them for the next 7 hours about the theory of tennis. You know, they get a taste of what it's like to hold the racket, to hit the ball. And likewise with music, you know, you want to have them making a note as early as possible and maybe model what the teacher's doing. It's very experiential. And I think you're on the right track there with a very participatory approach where they can see somebody stumble and realize that, hey, that person's still breathing and life goes on and we're going to have those stumbles and it's okay.
I want to know from your side, Phil, what has been one of the most impactful value proposition that you're hearing from your customers right now? And then also on the other side of the coin is going forward, what are you guys working on that you're comfortable in socializing? What are you guys building on from a product perspective or with something else that you're comfortable in sharing that could get the potential where your existing customer a little excited?
Our customers are the most innovative people, right? So they figure out how to use our product in ways that I would never have thought about. I'll just use a very tactical example, which is not unique to us, but very relevant in the moment, which is if we own a unified, clean data set on travel, marrying all the different sources, right? We have an approach that we think is best in class around how do you bring managed program data with expense data together, right? Then I can do things with that information that's highly relevant. So right now, that's where are my people, right? How do I figure out where my people are? So is it exactly duty of care? No, but it inputs that. And we haven't thought about it. We don't build solutions around it. But hey, if I have an understanding of where people are and I have it on a cleaner data set, I can understand where people are today, where are they expected to be, do we have any volumes going to these other places so I can be proactive? And there's a lot of people that have been going in and the TMCs and OBTs have done an awesome job partnering to, hey, let's cut off and make sure that someone can't book to fill in the blank. But when it's already happened or when people are in transit, it's sometimes hard to figure out where people are and every person matters. So that's an example where like in the last few weeks, people just took our product and did stuff with it that wasn't supportive. And that's to me the most exciting things. We've had examples of that through people use Clarasight to really reimagine the way they do supplier relationships. We want to build a suite of capabilities around the supplier lifecycle, but I've got some customers that have completely changed the way they run QBRs with their air and hotel vendors leveraging our capabilities. And they can come to the table and they can say, because we own the underlying unified data set. So what does truth look like? And then we also use that information to help forecast demand across the business. And that's a core set of foundational components. If I understand my demand, I can go to a supplier and say, hey, here's how my contract is performing. Here's what we would agree historical volumes are, but here's what I think my volumes are going to be on these routes. Let's have a conversation. What's important? What type of equipment is going to be on it? Other types of things. And the suppliers really want to understand that demand because they want share of wallet of the critical routes that are most important to you. And so that's an example where, like, I didn't really do that. Just a set of our customers started doing it with their suppliers, and the suppliers were like, how are you forecasting your demand? And they're like, we use Clarasight to do it. And so I can have a better conversation. And that helped us work with some of the suppliers, because everyone wants more data and more transparency to be better partners together. So I think that would be like a couple of examples, all customer driven in terms of the way they use our product, that are most exciting to me. Where are we going next? There's so many things that we're doing that I think are fun. But from an AI perspective, I think what we'd say is we have a whole kind of part of our roadmap focused on what I'll call removing the cognitive load on the travel manager, meaning two layers. One, how do I automate some of the manual processes that you do today? And then two, how do I actually automate some of the decisions that you're being forced to make, but you actually don't need to make them, because there are a set of rules and parameters where you don't need to make this decision. We can passively make that decision for you. So like approvals is a great example, which is it's really hard to get the right approval structures right. And so there's a ton of noise. And so therefore you get inundated with these things and you just approve everything. Now there's some workflows of, hey, how do I automate a workflow? But then there's decisions. Should I approve or not? And the cognitive load associated with those two things are pretty overwhelming for a lot of people. And we have a suite of capabilities that we're supporting that automate the workflow and reduce the cognitive load by helping automate the decision so that you don't have to. You can just focus on the escalations or the things that matter. And I think that's what I'm most excited about delivering against.
It reminds me of one of our first podcasts with Gene Quinn when he said AI is here to remove the drudgery from our world, taking things that we don't want to do or need to do. So we're getting to that point where we are approaching the flash prediction game, Philip. So we can get into it, but caveat is there's some Web3 component to these 4 questions. Phil, let us know if you want us to skip any of these, but love to get your take to see if you are comfortable with those.
Now I'm getting scared.
I'm going to a conference in Fort Worth, Dallas called HFTP, or Hospitality Upgrade. And I'm going to be doing a keynote on investment in travel and hospitality, but focus on Web3 and AI. And my whole thesis is the convergence of these two space or technology, if you will, right? Like, why is Web3 technologies and AI agentics innovation multiplier, right? So I don't look at them as two separate tracks. I look at them as, two tracks colliding, because there's a lot of reason behind why I think AI agents is going to need Web3 technologies. So with that, one of the first thing that I'm focusing on is stablecoins. It's here. It's been looked at by a lot of enterprise companies and CFOs. There's rumors, conversations around, for example, I think Amazon is talking about it. I think Walmart's talking about developing their own stablecoin. Question on this flash prediction game is multiple choice. The thesis is that stablecoins will be a standard payment option for travel. For example, you're going to be able to use, let's say, a stablecoin like USDC to be able to book on Expedia or Booking or a brand or supplier website. The option, do you think this is not going to happen, where stablecoins is not going to be a payment option? or that it will become a payment option within 2 years. And option C is 3 to 5 years. So A, B, or C?
But I think thematically, you said two things that I think are really important, which is you talked about the convergence of Web3 and AI. And what I'd say is there's sort of two things that happen in any new environment, which is there's a huge sort of bubble of stuff where it's let's just figure out what you can do with this thing, right? NFTs are a great example of this, right? And then what sticks around is it's not about the thing, it's about what the thing enables. And the reason why all these things are coming together is because when you focus on the value delivery of what's the impact they can have, they are both serving a purpose which actually align to value. And so when you remove the fluff, you get to why it's valuable. And so the construct where you can use a ledger to facilitate global interactions is really important in a world where actually non-determinism is becoming more important, like in an AI world, right? That is a non-determic set of black box processes. In order to understand truth, you have to have transparency and audibility. So like, I just naturally see these things coming together because the benefit of AI is actually what's hurting generative AI, which is it is non-deterministic, it is black box, and you cannot predict the outcomes. And so therefore, having an underlying set of transparent ledgers is going to be critically important. Now, beyond that, stablecoin is an example. Like, it clearly has value, and it's not just a thing. And the question is, how fast does that value get adopted? I don't know. There's not a lot of places you can use Bitcoin to pay for travel, but you can.
Yeah.
It's just, is it going to be broadly adopted? I don't know.
From a stablecoin perspective, if I'm having a conversation with CFO, I think they immediately get it, because if you take a percentage of their payment options and you say, okay, this slice, let's say 20% of your customer is going to be paying with stablecoin, that's going to reduce anywhere between 2 to 3% of your credit card network transaction fees. They're going to get it right away. The fact that in terms of like supplier management, instant settlement, they're going to get that right away as well. So there's a value proposition on that. And I think one of the biggest thing also is that with regulation and Clarity Act and Genius Act and so forth, there's clarity on how stablecoin yield may work. So if you're a CFO and you say, hey, if I have a percentage of my customer paying via USDC stablecoin, and just by holding this in my treasury, I'm going to get a 4% yield on that. That looks interesting. Joe, I think you got the next question.
So, question number two, AI on our phones, such as Siri, will be the primary agent that will orchestrate with other agents to simplify our lives in finance, travel, medical, etc. And the theory here is that there will be an agent marketplace, Phil, just like there are app stores today. And the question for you, sir, is this A, not going to happen, B, within 2 years, C, 3 to 5 years, or D, it won't be on a phone?
I don't think there's any question that for lots of interactions, agent to agent is going to be the future state. For all interactions, no, but for lots of interactions, yes. Do I think it's the next 24 months? No, I don't. And it's mostly because I think corporate adoption is much lower and there are some problems with it. But do I think it's going to start happening? Absolutely. But is it going to be broad-based? I'm struggling to see that path. I think B2C, you'll start to see more of it. B2B will be slower on the adoption side, particularly as you go up into the enterprise. On the phone, much smarter people have told me that the phone is going to have a new form factor. I don't know what it is. I don't know a better option, so I'm not going to pretend to have the answer. Going to be these step changes in form factors as we learn.
Mike, I think you have the next question.
Yeah, so my next question is around hyper-personalization in travel. And I think a lot of us firmly believe that in the past, hyper-personalization from the supplier side has not come to fruition, just because the fact that they only have a snapshot of individual travel. But now with Agentic AI, I think the more access we give them, the deeper access to our data they have. Hyper personalization in travel is definitely here do you believe that to be true or false?
I think hyper-personalization is absolutely what will happen. I think the limiting factors are context windows right now. And so the context window has a couple of different parts. Do I have the right information? And so hyper-personalization to actually really work needs a very wide context window because, and I'll just talk about how we're thinking about it right now, which is I can use AI to recommend the optimal outcome for you. And we do that. Like, what is the optimal travel policy for you to save X amount of dollars? But the problem is a business doesn't make a decision based on that. And this is true of humans. They have all these other input factors that make the decision they need to make not necessarily be the optimal one. And so when you think about personal travel, it's, some of the easier things that people talk about is like, all right, I know what my loyalty is, and I know my preferred travel times. But there's a litany of things that create these inputs that help make decisions that I think are going to be much harder to get the last 20%. The first 80, I think, is very doable. And it seems really clear to me. It's the last 20% that I think is going to prevent or is going to delay the broad-based adoption, because the way AI works today is essentially taking the averages of a bunch of inputs. I think hyper-personalization is here. The early part of it is going to be pretty fast adoption and pretty remarkable, but the last mile, which will really be required to truly automate the process, is going to be harder than we think to get the right inputs and right context on the pre and the post to inform the decision loops.
Fantastic.
Very
Well done.
cool. And Phil, our question number 4, we'll spare you the point 2 we foisted on a guest recently. The fourth question is stable coins will be the default payment rail for AI agents. True or false, sir?
I have no idea.
The 50-50.
I have absolutely no idea.
Phil, while I have 2 more seconds of your time, I was once in an Uber, and the Uber driver was a world-class tennis coach who took the opportunity to share with this business traveler, aka me, how much he had learned from Tai Chi about 2 theories of tennis. One was linear kinetic, and one was ripple of power. And I have not stopped thinking about that conversation ever since. So you just never know, business travelers out there, when your Uber driver is going to change your life. And so when we have Phil back next time, we'll start with which school does he subscribe to and tell us more about his tennis insights. Phil, this is all by way of saying it has been such an absolute pleasure to talk to you. So Phil, true pleasure to talk to you as ever. And thanks so much for being in our coffee shop. And we'll talk to you soon.
I thank you guys both. And Joel, you don't get enough credit, but when I talk about the community being so welcoming and educating of me early on, in many respects, I'm talking about you in all of the different lives you've had. I deeply appreciate the friendship and the support that you've given me at Clarasight on the journey.
Kind of you. Thank you. My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks again. Thank you. Phil.
Thanks so much, Phil. Have a great one. Cheers.
Thanks for joining Joel and Mike for another episode of Travel Around the Block. If you have any questions or topics you would like to see discussed on the show, or if you'd like to be considered as a potential guest or sponsor, please reach out to us at hello@travelaroundtheblock.com. And of course, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Wishing you a wonderful day wherever you are around the block.